Hi friends, it's Jeff. There are a lot of paycheck rules out there, and it can be quite confusing. There's the 50-30-20 rule, for example, that says 50% of your income, your after-tax income, should be allocated towards your fixed expenses. And if you have more than 50% of your income going into your fixed expenses, well, you've done something wrong. 30% should be allocated toward discretionary spending like a gift or a vacation, and 20% should go towards either an emergency fund, paying down debt, or investing in your future, like a 401k, for example. But if the 50-30-20 rule is the one that's most prevalent out there, then why is there also a 60-30-10 rule, or a rule called the envelope system, or an 80-20 rule, or a 50-15-5 rule, which ironically doesn't add up to 100%, but let's not quibble over the details. The point is, there's a lot of rules out there, and they're not right for every situation. The purpose of this video is to clarify which rule is best for you, and in doing so, help you get a lot more comfortable about your station in life. All right, let's go. The genesis of this video, by the way, is an email I got from a friend of mine. Now, normally when you have a friend from the past, you always promise to stay in touch when one of you leaves the company or the organization, the club, whatever it was that the two of you belong to, but 9 times out of 10 that doesn't really happen. But in this case it did. He sent an innocuous email. The subject line said paycheck rule with 2 question marks. When I opened it, he said that he was confused because he was told about this 50-30-20 rule, but he couldn't follow it because he just couldn't limit his spending to non-discretionary things to 50% of his take-home income. My guess is, given where he is in life, which is a few years out from retiring, he's like a lot of people. He has a mortgage, he's paying for his kids' college, he has a utility bill, he has a lot of fixed costs that just creep up on you in time. That's just the nature of life in many cases. So I asked him to give me a call the next day, and after the usual catch-up, I asked him about this information that he received, the 50-30-20 rule. I asked him what the source of the information was, and frankly, I was pretty sure of the source, but I wanted him to tell me because I could be wrong. Sure enough, the source was the 401k plan provider and their annual visit to the company. The 401k provider said that people just aren't saving enough. Now, this is true. There is no question about that. Whether the 50-30-20 rule is appropriate for my friend or not was TBD, but certainly, on average, people are not saving enough for retirement. And then we had the real discussion, the one that should have happened with the 401k provider. Let's start off with the number that I think is actually right in that equation, 50-30-20, and that's the 20. 20% of his income should be used to be paying down debt or funding his retirement accounts. At this station in life, which is 2 years out, for him anyway, this is the optimal number given where he was at in his obligations. And I will say that's 20% plus the employer 401k match if you can get there that way. But if you can't get there that way, then add the 401k contribution from your employer. But 20% is a really good number for someone who's 2 years out from retiring. But here's where it gets confusing. If you're in your 20s and you have no debt and you have no family and no other obligations, that 20% should be higher. But yet, in your 20s, you're not earning a lot of money. But the reason it should be higher is because you have time on your hands. And with time, you have the ability to double and then double and double your investments again and again and again. At 58 years old, which is how old my friend is, he doesn't have that time. So what he's putting in now is effectively what he's going to be taking out in the future, plus a bit of growth. By the way, if you're in your 20s or even early 30s and you don't have a lot of obligations, a lot of debt, I would say instead of 50-30-20, it should be 50-20-30, where 30% of your income is going into something retirement related, and if you have debt, paying that debt down ASAP, because that gives you a lot of time for that investment to grow. So for my colleague, I said, how much do you actually spend every month on fixed costs? He said, well, it's about 65% of my take-home pay. I said, so why not make it a 65-15-20 rule? And he said, because I've got to live my life. And I said, I get it, but you're 2 years out from retirement. Now, if you have a lot of money saved for retirement and you're comfortable with the amount of money you have saved, then maybe you don't need to put in 20% towards a 401k or paying down debt. However, if you are behind, then that 20% number is sacrosanct, frankly. And I said, besides, once you hit retirement, that 20% number is going to go away. And by the way, I'll explain that to everybody in just a moment on this video. But if you're inside retirement, 20% is a pretty important number. Once you're retired, there is no 20% because you're drawing down. But I digress. So what do you do with that 20%? Should you save it or should you pay down debt? Well, it depends. If you have a lot of credit card debt, my strong recommendation here is pay off your credit card debt. And the reason is simple, because if you have 18% credit card debt, that's guaranteed. That's a guaranteed negative return of 18%. However, you don't have a guaranteed positive return of 18% in the market. And frankly, credit card debt weighs you down in retirement. If you don't have credit card debt, make sure that you have an emergency fund that's appropriate for your situation. While you're still working, it's 3 to 6 months worth of your take-home income. Why is it 3 to 6 months? Because that replaces your income if you become unemployed. But is it still 3 to 6 months if you retire? Well, no, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. But what about paying down your mortgage? If you don't have credit card debt, but you have a mortgage, well, rather than dedicating all of your funds towards paying off your mortgage, which people do, I'd dedicate your funds to paying an extra mortgage payment or two per year. Why is that? Well, if you step back in time and you said 10 years ago, I'm going to take all of my money and pay off my mortgage, all extra money, well, you'd be faced with a situation where you have no mortgage, but you also have no 401k or no retirement account for those of you that don't have a pension. Now, that's a very bad situation to be in. Now, if you can do both, great, but most people can't. So if you have a sensible interest rate on your mortgage and you're going into retirement with a low interest rate mortgage, perhaps the better strategy is just to make an extra payment or two on your mortgage, unless you're really comfortable with the amount of money you have in your 401k. This is a different decision than paying off an 18% interest rate credit card, because that has real financial ramifications on your cash flow. A mortgage does too, but the reality is, unless you are going to hit it just right, at this point, 2 years out anyway, you're going to have a mortgage payment, at least for a little while in retirement. Finally, if you don't have an emergency fund, that should be your top priority, right up there with paying off credit card debt, even more so than funding your 401k. Now, I will say fund your 401k to the maximum of your employer match. So if your employer matches a certain amount, put whatever you need into that 401k to get that maximum match. But an emergency fund is really important. It's right up there with car insurance in terms of protecting you in case something goes wrong. All right, what about the rest of your paycheck, the other 80%? Well, in most cases, people can't only fund their life with 50% of their take-home pay. It happens, of course. If people live a very Spartan life, that's entirely doable. Or if they make a lot of money, that's entirely doable. But for the average person out there, 50% is just too low. So think about 60 or 65. The hard number is the 20%. The soft number is the discretionary amount. Well, what about after you retire? Well, this is where it all changes. You don't need to save 20% anymore. In fact, I can't really see a situation where you're drawing 20% from your 401k only to reinvest it later in the year. First, you'll be facing tax implications with that. But second, unless you are doing some sort of a Roth conversion, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. Just leave it in the retirement account, the 401k or the IRA. You should just withdraw 20% less. Maybe 20% makes sense if you have a pension, and the pension that you have is similar to your income pre-retirement, and so you have excess. There, you might want to save part of your pension. However, for the vast majority of people watching this video, that's not the case. So don't rob Peter to pay Paul. Likewise, your emergency fund should be sized to the actual emergencies that you could be facing in retirement. Not unemployment, because, let's be honest, you're unemployed, but rather the type of emergencies that the average retiree might face, like a new car at some point in the future. Start saving now for that. Or long-term care if you don't have a long-term care policy. So what does this really mean? Well, instead of 50-30-20, you reduce your intake to 80% and make it 50-30, which I suppose is 62.5, 37.5. And by the way, if you still have credit card debt or you don't have an emergency fund or not the appropriate emergency fund, this is job one with your discretionary income. You still need to live your life, of course, but paying down that credit card debt pronto or building your emergency fund pronto is really, really important. If you like this video, check out that video. Retirees spend 80% of their income in these 5 areas. Also, if you'd like to see another side of me, check me out on Facebook at facebook.com/Jeffrey M. Schmidt. This is Jeff Schmidt, and I'll see you on the next video.
Holy Schmidt!